Recorded Books is pleased to present the Modern Scholar Series, where great professors teach you. My name is Jim Frangione, and I'll be your host. Today we begin a course entitled Medieval Mysteries, the History Behind the Myths of Middle Ages. Your professor will be Thomas F. Madden. Thomas F. Madden is Professor of History and Director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at St. Louis University. His numerous publications include The Concise History of the Crusades, Roman and Littlefield, 2013, Venice, A New History, Viking, 2012, Empires of Trust, Viking, 2008, Enrico Dandolo and the Rise of Venice, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2003, and The Fourth Crusade, University of Pennsylvania Press, 1997. He is a recognized expert on premodern history, appearing in such venues as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, and the History Channel. His scholarly awards include the Haskins Medal of the Medieval Academy of America and the Otto Grundler Prize of the Medieval Institute. He is a Fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and a Fellow of the Medieval Academy of America. And now we begin Medieval Mysteries, the history behind the myths of the Middle Ages. Lecture 1. King Arthur, Man versus Myth.
In this course, we're going to look at various topics, all of which have to do with myths and legends of the Middle Ages that most people know about, those types of topics that we think about when we think of the Middle Ages. And we're going to, in each case, look at what is the actual history behind these myths and legends. Is there actually a kernel of truth behind them, or perhaps a substantial amount of truth behind them? Now, for the Middle Ages, we could pick a large number of possible topics. We're just doing 8 here in this course. And I chose these 8 because they are all something that most people have heard about and have some kind of image in their mind about these topics when they think about the Middle Ages. So our first lecture, this lecture, will be about the quintessential king of the Middle Ages, King Arthur. Then in lecture 2, we will look at a associated myth and legend, one that's closely associated with King Arthur, and that is the Holy Grail and the legends of the Holy Grail. In our third lecture, we'll shift gears a bit, go down further south, and look at the myth of Pope Joan, a female pope who was supposed to have reigned in Rome in the 10th century. In our fourth lecture, we'll go down into the dungeons of the Middle Ages and examine just what was the situation with witches and with the Inquisition and the burnings and torturings that we associate with the Middle Ages. In the fifth lecture, we'll look at some of the sexual myths of the Middle Ages, in particular the use of chastity belts and also what's called the rite of the first night, or the Ius Primae Noctis. And we'll look at both of those various sexual myths in lecture 5. Lecture 6 will be, of course, you can hardly talk about myths of the Middle Ages without talking about Robin Hood and his merry men in Sherwood Forest. In lecture 7, as we're looking now more at the late Middle Ages, we'll look at the widespread myth of the flat earth. In other words, the idea that in the Middle Ages, people believed that the earth was flat and that they would fall off the edge if they went too far away. And then finally, we will finish up in lecture 8 with a look at least the medieval evidence for probably the most famous relic of Christianity, and that is the Shroud of Turin. So in this lecture, we're going to begin with King Arthur. And I don't think I need to say very much about who King Arthur is, at least in legend. Most people know the basics of the story of King Arthur. Most people know about the sword and the stone that he pulls out, his great kingdom of Camelot, the Round Table, of course, in which the knights all sit, his sword, Excalibur, his court magician, Merlin, his wife, Guinevere, all the various knights, Sir Kay, Sir Bedivere, and of course Sir Lancelot, and then his archenemy, Mordred, and his final resting spot at Avalon. You really see King Arthur everywhere in our culture today. It's not surprising. He comes out of an English legends and myths, and so it's not surprising that we have it in our own modern culture as well. I mean, you can see him in movies like Disney's movie Sword in the Stone, the old comics of Prince Valiant. Of course, there's the musical Camelot. Mark Twain wrote his very famous book, The Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. And you can even find him on the bags of flour with the King Arthur flour. So what is this legend? And more importantly, who is it? Who was Arthur? Did he in fact exist? Well, to understand this, to understand Arthur, we need to look a little bit more closely at the situation in the period in which he is supposed to have lived. And this is in the 5th century Rome. In the 5th century, in the Roman Empire, things were very bad. The empire was collapsing. There were Germanic barbarians who were invading all parts of the West. And therefore, to protect the core, the Romans were withdrawing their forces from the periphery, from the edges of the empire. And that meant Britain. And so the Roman forces were leaving Britain, and that meant that Britain was at the mercy of any of the barbarians that decided to attack. Now, the people who lived there were the Britons. Many of these Britons were Romanized, naturally, because they had lived with the Romans for so long, and that meant not only did they speak Latin, but they were also Christians. During the 5th century now, these new groups come in, and they invade primarily from the northern parts of Germany, in other words, Saxony, and also from Scandinavia. So you have a number of Northmen, you have Saxons, and Angles, or the Anglo-Saxons, who invade. These are very fierce warriors, and they are not Britons. They're not Celtic, in other words, the way the Britons are. They're Germanic, and they're also pagans. They're not Christians. And the invasion of Britain would be really devastating. It would destroy this Romano-Briton culture that had existed there, and it would cause, well, by between 410 and 450 AD, really the island was reduced to local kings all warring amongst themselves. Eventually, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Anglo-Saxons are the ones that we now would refer to as English coming from Angle or Angle-ish, they capture all of eastern and central England. The Britons still hold out in the west, holding on to areas like Devon and Cornwall, and most importantly, Wales. So it is in this period of fighting between what was left of the Britons, fighting against these new invaders, the Anglo-Saxons, that we find Arthur. Whoever he was, or if he was a Briton, and he was defending against the Saxon invaders. Now, the problem with getting to him is that the Britons, from this period, wrote almost nothing, and the oral traditions that they passed on about these wars are largely lost. The Anglo-Saxons, who were fighting against the Britons, began writing later, after the kingdoms were better established, but they make no mention of any Arthur. So, for example, if we look at Bede, the Venerable Bede, who wrote a massive history of the English people, he says a great deal about the wars against the Britons, but nothing at all about an Arthur. The first time that we hear about Arthur, it comes from a Welsh or Celtic chronicle that was written in either the 8th or the 9th century. So we're talking about a number of centuries after the events. And it is therefore probably relying on oral traditions that may have been altered a great deal by that time. This history is called the Historia Britonum, or in other words, the history of the Britons. It's a very pro-Briton, pro-Welsh kind of history, as you might imagine. In it, it lists 12 battles in which, as it says, Arthur fought against the Saxons with the kings of the Britons. So in other words, Arthur is not referred to as a king himself, but rather as a sort of commander. And it says that each of these 12 battles, Arthur was victorious. The last of these battles was at Mount Badon. And it says that at Mount Badon was where in one day 960 men were killed by one attack of Arthur's, and no one but himself laid them low. The only other real mention of Arthur in this text is at the end. And at the end of it, it kind of finishes up with a list of the wonders of Britain. And the wonders are essentially magical sorts of things that one can find there. One of them is a stone or a cairn. It's a pile of stones. And on the top of it is a stone that has a dog's paw print on it. And it was said that this paw print was from Arthur's dog. And the Historia says, and people come and carry away the stone in their hands for a period of a day and a night. And on the following day, it's found on the top of the heap. Like a good dog, this dog stone always returns. It also refers to a tomb in which it says lies Amr, who is the son of Arthur, whom Arthur killed. And then it says, quote, and people come to measure the tomb. It is now 6 feet, now 9, now 12, now 15 in length. And whatever size you will measure it on one occasion, you will not again find it the same size. And I myself have tested this. End quote. So this is the earliest representation of Arthur, and it's centuries after he supposedly existed. And there's not a lot of meat there, except that he was a commander. That's really all we're told. But it's clear that there were stories about Arthur being told orally, therefore in Wales. The next mention that we have comes from another Welsh tract, the Annals Cambriae, or the Annals of Wales. It was compiled in the 8th or the 9th centuries. Like a lot of annals, it lists each year separately. So for a year, unfortunately it does not use the Anno Domini years, but for a year that roughly corresponds to 516, it lists, quote, the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur bore the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Britons were the victors, end quote. And then further down, for around the year 537, it lists the Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medro perished, and there was a plague in Britain and Ireland. Now, the problem with the Annals Cambriae is that the manuscripts for which that we have, they're late. In other words, they're copies of earlier ones. And so it's possible that these annals are actually using the source that we just talked about, the Historia Britonum, as their own source. And if that's the case, we're not really getting anything new here. Well, what about archaeology? Can archaeology tell us anything? Archaeology can tell us a lot about how people lived and where they lived, and sometimes a little bit about their social characteristics. But it's a very blunt instrument to try to figure out whether one person lived or not. Nevertheless, in 1998, there was a bit of a stir when a stone was found in the ruins of Tintagel Castle in Cornwall. And there are some later stories that say that Arthur was believed to have been conceived in Tintagel Castle. And this stone, it was broken, but it had an inscription in which it mentioned a person, Artogno, who made whatever this stone was originally attached to. The stone has Christian symbols on it, and it clearly dates to the 6th century, which is the right time. But beyond that, there's not much we can say. It doesn't appear to be any major connection between it and Arthur. The primary thing it can tell us is that Arthur, or the version of Arthur, Artugno, was a name that was not unusual at the time in which Arthur is supposed to have lived. What about Badon Hill, this Battle of Badon Hill? What is that? We have no idea where Badon Hill was. Several places claim to be Badon Hill. It's very good for tourist trade, as you might imagine. One of them is Cadbury Camp in Somerset. Now, another author, Gildas, who was writing a history in the 6th century, in which he entitled it The Ruin of Britain, he refers to an upsurge of momentum for the Britons, which lasted up until, as he calls it, the Siege of Badon Hill. This was, he says, the last defeat of the villains, and by that he means the Saxons. Unfortunately, Gildas says nothing about the commander there, so there's no mention of Arthur. Bede, who I just mentioned, an Anglo-Saxon historian, or English historian, writing in the 8th century, he also mentions the Battle of Badon Hill, but he also does not mention anything about Arthur. Well, that's about all we have, really, for historical Arthur, are those texts and a little bit of archaeology. So did he exist? Perhaps. Or perhaps he was just a mythical hero who was given victories by later legends. The Welsh, the Celts, were very big into these kind of mythical superhuman heroes, and it's quite possible that Arthur was simply one of them. Or perhaps he was simply a Romano-Briton commander, someone who was of mixed heritage between Romans and Britons. The Romans did have a name called Arturius, and perhaps he remained when the Romans left, and he was a commander. There's just simply no way to know. Well, that's about all we can say about Arthur. After that, we are really just chasing a legend and a story told around campfires and sung by bards, but a story that was always changing. And so that's what we're going to look at in the remainder of this lecture. How did this legend of Arthur develop over time? There's no doubt that the Welsh held on to Arthur, bringing him into various tales that they told orally. Now, of course, oral tales are not good for us because they're not recorded. The earliest surviving written poems that can be found in a medieval manuscript, in other words, a manuscript that actually dates back to the Middle Ages, are from the 13th century. So we're talking about the High Middle Ages here. We find these in two sources, the Black Book of Carmarthen and another, the Book of Taliesin. Both of these have various poems that mention Arthur. Usually, these are just a reference to his military skill. One poem is a dialogue between Arthur and a gatekeeper of a fortress. And Arthur is asked the name of his men, and Arthur gives him the name of his men, and they include names that will become important later. One is Kay, and another is Bedivere. But there's lots of others, too, that end up falling out of the legend. There's also, in these books, a reference to magical adventures, such as Arthur's victory over a hag and an expedition to capture a magic cauldron. This cauldron had special magic such that it would not cook the food of a coward. In one of the poems in these books, there is a list of graves of great warriors, and it refers to, quote, concealed to doomsday, the grave of Arthur. And this and other references suggest that some Welsh, by this period, at least believed that Arthur would return one day, that his grave was somehow not found. But that was just one story. So clearly, by the 13th century, there was a body of stories that were circulating around about Arthur. Arthur was simply being used as a vehicle for these stories. Just to give a few other examples, there was a Welsh prose tale called Colwich and Olwen that can be dated to around 1100, in which it weaves together some old and some new stories. In this, Arthur's kinman, Colwich, sees a girl, Olwen, who is the daughter of a giant, and he falls in love with her. And the giant, Isbadin, gives Colwich a series of impossible tasks, and so Arthur and his court come and help out Colwich. It's 40-some tasks or so. About a dozen of them are actually described. The main one is the hunting of a magical boar. Subsequently, Arthur also appears in a few Welsh saints' lives, more as a kind of a well-known plot device than anything else. Just to give a few examples, the life of St. Caddoc, which was set in 1075, roughly in 1075, Arthur is depicted as playing dice with Kay and Bedivere on a hill, and an eloping couple runs by. They're trying to avoid pursuers who don't want them to elope. And in this story, Arthur first wants to rape the woman, but he's talked into defending the couple by his friends. 3 of his men are killed, and then he demands certain cattle in return, and then St. Caddoc, who is what this story is all about, provides them miraculously. There's also the life of Saint Ceranog, written around 1100. In that life, Ceranog comes to Arthur's lands searching for an altar, which he had previously cast adrift to see where it would go, so that he would know where he should preach next. And Arthur agrees to help if Ceranog will take care of a snake that is ravaging his lands. And so through prayer, Ceranog succeeds, and then Arthur brings out the altar, which he had all along, saying that he tried to use it as a table, but every time he put something on it, it magically flew off. So these are the kinds of stories that we're getting. Just one more, the life of St. Gildas, written around 1130. It's more important, I think, because in this one, and perhaps firstly in this one, it refers to Arthur as being, quote, the king of the whole of Britain. That's really the earliest reference we have to Arthur being a king rather than just being a commander. In this story, it relates how Arthur's wife, Guinevere, which is obviously an early version of Guinevere, had been raped and carried away by another rival king, Melvas. Melvas then fled to Glastonbury, and Arthur came with all of his forces. But now Glastonbury, there was a very large monastery, abbey there, and the abbot at Glastonbury came out and made peace between the two, and he got Guinevere returned. So these are the earliest stories that we have before Arthur becomes really firmly established as a king in the legends. Where we see this first, and most importantly, is in William of Malmesbury's work, written in 1125, called the Gesta Regum Anglorum, the Deeds of the Kings of England. William of Malmesbury says, "This is that Arthur of whom the British tales rave today, who plainly deserves not lying fables, but true stories, for he long sustained his sinking country and roused the broken courage of his citizens for war. Afterwards, in the siege of Badon Hill, spurred on by the image of the Mother of our Lord, which he habitually bore as his arms, he slew 900 of the enemy by his own hand in an incredible slaughter." So William of Malmesbury accepts Arthur as real, and remember, he's writing the history of the English kings. So Arthur's a British king, so he's referring back to him. He accepts him as real, but he's discounting all of these magical stories that the Welsh tell about him. And he concludes it by saying, quote, "The grave of Arthur is nowhere to be seen, whence the ancient tales fable that he is to come again." Now, William of Malmesbury's work is very closely followed, within a decade, followed by another monumentally important work for Arthur, and that is Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. This History of the Kings of Britain is really designed to push the history back. Geoffrey was a master at Oxford. He was a very learned man. He was originally from either Cornwall or Wales. He appears to have really wanted to provide a British version of William of Malmesbury's work, focusing on his own nation, the Welsh, the Britons. Overall, he seems to have collected all the information that he could find from every sort of source, real and fantastic, and then he wrote what is really a literary fiction, filling in all the gaps with his own imagination. But it was taken as fact after it was written. He begins at the beginning with the foundation of Britain. He says it was founded by Brutus of Troy, who came, of course, from Troy. And then he also talks about people like Lude, from who he says London got its name, King Lear, who would later be immortalized by Shakespeare. And then he refers to Julius Caesar's attempts to conquer Britain. The last third of this book is about Arthur. And in it, it tells a lot of the story about Arthur using whatever legends he had and then filling those in. And many of these become central to the Arthur myth. He tells how Arthur's father, Uther, falls in love with his enemy's wife. Uther's magician, Merlin, then magically disguises Uther so that he looks just like her husband, his enemy. And then, that way, the two of them can sleep together. She conceives then Arthur. Shortly thereafter, the husband dies, and Uther marries her. So, as it turns out, everything's okay. Uther then is later poisoned by the Saxons, and Arthur becomes king of Britain when he's 15 years old. He campaigns against the Saxons, and Geoffrey uses those 12 battles from the Historia, and he defeats them. He's also allied with the Bretons. The Bretons are people from Brittany across the water, and their leader, whose name is Hol, is his right-hand man. Arthur then marries Guinevere, who is a daughter of a Cornish nobleman, clearly Guinevere, and then he marches off to conquer. He begins conquering all over. He conquers Ireland, then he conquers Iceland, Gothland, the Orkneys. Next he conquers Norway, then Denmark, then Aquitaine and Gaul. And he returns to England for a big celebration. And Geoffrey describes at length the glories of his court and all the great celebrations. Then the Roman Emperor, Lucius Tiberius, sends messengers to Arthur demanding a tribute from him, since Britain had once been part of the Roman Empire. Arthur and his nobles, of course, are very upset about this, and they agree that they must repay this insult by marching on Rome. So Arthur leaves his nephew, Modred, in charge, and he heads off to France. And there he defeats a giant, and then meets the Roman forces at Sesia, which is probably a reform of Soissons. The Roman emperor is killed, the Romans lose, but there are a lot of British losses as well, including Sir Kay and Sir Bedivere die. Arthur then sends the body of the emperor, Lucius, back to Rome and tells them that that is the tribute that they requested. It was at this point that Arthur hears that Modred, back home, had been telling everyone that he, Arthur, was dead and had claimed the kingdom and even had married Guinevere. And so Arthur returns to Britain and Modred retreats to Cornwall. Both sides raise their troops and they have a massive battle with very large-scale losses on both sides. Modred is killed and Arthur is severely wounded. And then it's at this point that Arthur is taken to the mysterious island of Avalon for his wounds to heal. Guinevere goes to a convent, and the kingdom is given to a kinsman of Arthur's, Constantine. The book then quickly goes on to describe the remaining kings of Britain until Cadwallon in the 7th century. This was an immensely popular book. More than 200 manuscripts survive today of it, which means that for the Middle Ages, this was a bestseller. And that means that this basic story became very important. Now, if that was just the story, we would have an Arthur that was a little bit different than the one that we tend to think about, because the real refinement of Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table really comes not from the English or the Welsh, but it comes instead from the French. High culture in the High Middle Ages was in France. This was the culture of courtly poetry, courtly lays. The whole idea of the courtly romance comes from France. And there was an enormous amount of production of these poems and stories of ladies and knights and all of the rest at this time. Arthur, who was of course British, made its way into France, perhaps in part because of the Norman conquest of England, which put French speakers into positions of authority, including the king and queen. Henry II, King Henry II, and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine were both from France and both spoke French. One author, Wace, produced in 1155 for the new queen an elegant French version of these stories about Arthur. And this was called the Roman de Brut. It was much more beautiful than Geoffrey's work. It was focused on chivalric deeds, and it omitted a lot of the Merlin prophecies. But it's really Wace's work that invents the round table at which the knights sit because they kept arguing over who was the greatest. In this earliest round table, though, Arthur doesn't sit at it. He sits at a head table, but the knights all sit at the round table. This story, Wace's Brut, was very popular in France, and it would kind of help to spawn a whole genre of romances there. French knowledge of these Arthurian legends, it wasn't just from Wace, though. Some of the earliest lays, these courtly poems, predate Wace's work by a few decades. So it's likely that some of these stories about Arthur had been making their way from Britain into France before, probably from the Bretons, from the Bretons in Brittany, who heard them from the Welsh. For the Welsh and the Celtic listeners, Arthur was a national hero, but not for the French. For the French, his mythology was incorporated into a much wider genre of courtly romance. And so what the French writers did was they plucked the knights out of the story, and they wove around them romance. Arthur, therefore, in these new romances, was demoted first to a kind of a backdrop to what the knights were doing, and then into an ineffectual king. One of the earliest was those written by Marie de France. She touched on Arthur's courts in several of her poems, but it was really Christian de Troyes, writing in between 1170 and 1190, who really changed things. He invented a lot in his courtly poems, including the name Camelot, to refer to the kingdom. In one of his poems, Eric and Enid, Eric wins Enid by completing 2 quests, and then he brings her back to Arthur's court and devotes himself to her rather than to knightly deeds. They then have a misunderstanding and they undertake various adventures, but it all works out in the end. In another poem about Lancelot, Lancelot is a new character who's now introduced by Christian, and he is described as having an adulterous affair with Guinevere, but still within the courtly love tradition. Guinevere then is kidnapped by Meleagant, and Lancelot must seek her through all sorts of various quests, including crossing a bridge made of a single sharp sword blade. In another of Christian's poems, Yvain, the Knight and the Lion, Yvain wins and marries Lodin, but is then lured to Arthur's court. He promises to return in a year, but he doesn't, and the rest is his attempt to win back his love. There is a lion, too. He's helped by a lion. And finally, Percival's story that Christian writes, Percival and the Holy Grail. But we're going to talk more about that story in the next lecture, where we're going to be focusing completely on the Holy Grail. These French authors now, writing these courtly poems, are putting the focus on the knights. And it's not just the ones I've just mentioned. They're introducing other characters now who are also knights, like Galahad and Tristan and Isolde. In the 13th century, French prose stories start to be written too, including the very famous Lancelot Grail cycle, which was written in Middle French. These, as I say, added Galahad. Galahad was supposed to be the son of Lancelot and a woman, Elaine of Corbenic, whom Lancelot, he mistook her for his mistress Guinevere, and that's how they ended up getting together. Galahad is the greatest of the knights. He finds the Grail and subsequently is brought to heaven bodily by angels. The Lancelot Grail cycle also makes Modred the offspring of Arthur and an incestuous relationship between Arthur and his sister. All of these stories put Arthur further now on the periphery, even more so than he was before. The final culmination of all this myth-making and stories and courtly poetry can be found in the famous work by Thomas Malory, La Mort d'Arthur, the Death of Arthur. Despite the title, which it's always known as today, La Mort d'Arthur, it was actually an English book. It was written in English, and it was meant to bring together all of these stories, but particularly these French cycles, these prose cycles. Once the printing press came about, it was one of the very first books printed in England. And so it set in stone this Arthur legend, and it formed the basis for all subsequent adaptations. And in fact, if you look at La Mort d'Arthur, you'll notice that most of it is the story of this knight, the story of that knight. There's very little of it about Arthur. It's mostly about the knights and their various quests. Arthur had political implications at the time, too. The Welsh continued to hold Arthur as a rallying cry, hoping for his return and his victory over the Anglo-Normans. But these dreams were delivered a major blow in 1191. It was then that the monks at Glastonbury Abbey began searching for the body of Arthur in their cemetery, and they found it, or at least so they said. One of the earliest descriptions of it say that, quote, they found a certain coffin in which they saw a woman's bones with the hair still intact. When this was removed, they found another coffin below the first containing a man's bones. This also being removed, they found a third below the first two, on which a lead cross was placed, on which was inscribed, "Here lies the famous King Arthur, buried in the Isle of Avalon." For that place was once surrounded by marshes and is called the Isle of Avalon, that is, the Isle of Apples. These bones were then taken and put in a place of honor for pilgrims to see, and for centuries pilgrims would come to see these bones. And the lead cross, in fact, it lasted until the 18th century. But the finding of the bones meant that the Welsh no longer were able to argue that King Arthur was going to return. And so this allowed Arthur to be used by the current kings of England as one of their own predecessors. And so we've seen how the story of Arthur, which began as a simple commander in Britain, if he existed at all, was transformed over time and continues to be transformed until our own day. In our next lecture, we're going to look at one aspect of the Arthurian legends, but one that ends up leaving the Arthurian legends, and that is the stories and legends of the Holy Grail.
This ends Lecture 1. Medieval Mysteries. The history behind the myths of the Middle Ages. Lecture 2. Medieval and modern mysteries of the Holy Grail.
In this lecture, we're going to look at another legend and myth of the Middle Ages, and that is the legend of the Holy Grail. I'm going to try to find out, first of all, what it is and how the legends developed in the Middle Ages about it, and why is it that people are still talking about the Holy Grail today. Well, if you're expecting to hear a story about some kind of chalice that has been preserved for many, many centuries, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. The fact is that the Holy Grail is never mentioned until the Middle Ages, really not until the 12th century, and it is purely an artifact of the Arthurian romances that come out of France that we were talking about in our last lecture. There have been some scholars who have tried to make an argument that the story of the Holy Grail may have had its origins in early Celtic legends of various kinds of cauldrons, magical cauldrons. And it is true that a lot of these Celtic legends did like the trope of a magic cauldron. One of the ones that's perhaps most closely connected to it would be the story of Bran the Blessed. He was a giant and also a king of Britain in the stories. And he was supposed to have had a magic cauldron that could restore people to life. Somebody died, you threw their body in it, and they would pop out. And so some people have said these kind of magic cauldrons might have been later morphed into the Holy Grail legends. But there doesn't seem to be any direct connection with them, and they seem very much to have come from these French romances. The word Grail, or Grail, is an old French word, and it means simply a cup, or a bowl, or a dish, something that is concave, that holds things. The first real reference to the Holy Grail comes in the poem of Christian de Troyes' Percival. And we alluded to this in the last lecture. And here we're going to look at it much more closely. It's an unfinished poem. It was written sometime between 1180 and 1191. And because it's so important for the history of the Holy Grail, we need to look a little bit more closely at this particular courtly poem. In the story, Percival is raised by his mother in the forests of Wales, but he goes off to Arthur's court to become a knight. And after proving himself by various courageous acts, he's eventually knighted. Then, like any good knight in the French romances, he heads off for adventure. Eventually, he comes across someone who is referred to as the Fisher King. He is a wounded king. The wound in this initial poem, it's not made clear, but he has some kind of bad wound which hampers him. And in fact, his whole kingdom is hampered by this wound. The whole kingdom has difficulties. And he's called the Fisher King because about all he can really do is fish in a river that is there. And there's a bridge that goes over the river. Well, Percival meets the Fisher King, and the Fisher King invites him into his castle to stay the night. And while he is there, Percival sits there for a while in a magnificent hall, and he talks to the Fisher King, and the Fisher King gives him a mighty sword and other sorts of things. But then we come to the part of the story in which the Grail appears. And I'm going to read this because it's very important to understand exactly what's being said. So it says, "While they were talking of one thing and another, a boy came from a chamber clutching a white lance by the middle of the shaft. And he passed between the fire and the two who were sitting on the bed. Everyone in the hall saw the white lance with its white head, and a drop of blood issued from the tip of the lance's head. And right down to the boy's hand this red drop ran. The Lord's guest," that's in other words Percival, "gazed at this marvel that had appeared there that night, but he restrained himself from asking how it came to be, because he remembered the advice of the nobleman who had made him a knight, who had taught and instructed him to beware of talking too much. He feared it would be considered base of him if he asked, and so he did not. Just then 2 other boys appeared, and in their hands they held candlesticks of the finest gold, inlaid with black enamel. The boys who carried the candlesticks were handsome indeed. In each candlestick burned 10 candles, at the very least. A girl who came in with the boys, fair and comely and beautifully adorned, was holding a Grail between her hands. And when she entered holding the Grail, so brilliant a light appeared that the candles lost their brightness like the stars or the moon when the sun rises. The Grail which went ahead was made of fine pure gold, and in it were set precious stones of many kinds, the richest and most precious in the earth or the sea. Those in the Grail surpassed all other jewels without a doubt. They passed before the bed, as the lance had done, and disappeared into another chamber. The boy saw them pass, in other words, this is Percival, saw them pass, but did not dare to ask who was served from the Grail, for he had taken the words of the wise nobleman to heart." End quote. Well, Percival then has a delightful dinner with the Fisher King and goes to sleep. The next morning, he wakes up and everyone is gone. There's no one there. He comes out, he looks around. He tries to open the door into which the Grail and the lance went, but it's closed tight. He can't open it. He goes outside, and there he finds his horse, all prepared for him to travel, and he therefore gets on it, and he leaves. And in fact, when he leaves, as he's crossing the bridge, his horse is kind of lifted up, and he makes it to the other side, but the bridge completely collapses so that he can't return. Eventually, Percival returns to Arthur's court, and while he's there, in one scene in the poem, a hideous girl arrives, and she denounces Percival. She says that had he asked about the lance, if he had just asked the Fisher King about the lance, and if he had asked who that Grail was going to serve, because it went into this other room and it was meant to serve someone something, that if he had just asked the Fisher King these questions, the Fisher King would have been healed, and so would have his land. But now his lands would fall into further ruin, and there would be great suffering, and it was all because of Percival, because he was afraid to ask about the Grail and the lance. Well, Percival felt very badly about this, and he swore that he would travel and travel. He'd never stay the same place for 2 nights. He would travel and he would adventure until he had finally learned whom the Grail served, and he had finally found out where the lance had gone. The story now begins to weave in and out, and it has another story about the knight Gawain, who is also looking for the lance, as it turns out. But eventually the story narrative returns to Percival, and Percival is in really bad shape. We haven't seen him for a little while by the time that it comes back to him. And he has completely forgotten about religion. For 5 years, he kind of rides about in a funk, never thinking about religion at all, never going to church. And in fact, he one day sees some people walking along the road, and they ask him, "Why are you bearing a shield? Why are you bearing weaponry? Today is Good Friday. Nobody should be doing that." And he's completely oblivious. He doesn't know it's Good Friday at all. But finally, on that same Good Friday, he finds a hermit a very holy man, who is also there with a priest of some sort. And he goes and he sees the hermit. And the hermit tells him to confess his sins and to receive absolution so that he can then do penance for all of his sins and he can be able to receive communion on Easter. And so Percival does exactly that. The hermit then reveals that he is in fact Percival's uncle. And he tells him that the Grail that he saw was going to serve his brother, who is obviously, therefore, another uncle. They are the brothers of Percival's mother. Now, it's clear that this Grail, as it's described, when I was reading before, if you were thinking of this as a cup, that's not what Christian wants you to think. It's clear that the Grail is meant to be a kind of a wide bowl, because the hermit tells him, don't imagine that what was in that bowl was a large fish. He mentions a few different kinds of large fish, that was not what was in there. So in other words, this was meant to be thought of as a fairly large platter or bowl. The mysterious brother king who was in that room, he tells us, quote, is served with a single host, in other words, the communion wafer, which is brought to him in that Grail. It comforts and sustains his life. The Grail is such a holy thing, and he who is so spiritual that he needs no more in his life than the host that comes in the Grail has lived there for 12 years without ever leaving that chamber which you saw the Grail enter. So what matters here, therefore, is that the Grail, it's never called the Holy Grail. It's called a Grail that is very important, it's very beautiful, but it's not the Holy Grail, it's the Grail. And what makes it powerful, what makes it holy, therefore, in Christian story, is not its beauty, but rather because in it is the host, the body of Christ, the communion wafer. So that's essentially the story that we hear the first time the Holy Grail, or the Grail, comes into literature in Christian de Troyes' Percival. In various other courtly romances in the 13th and 14th century, this Grail appears again. But in those, these are all stories of Arthur's knights, and the Grail then becomes a quest item. So it's something that various knights are trying to find. It's usually drawing from Percival. It's usually considered to be in some kind of Grail castle, one in which the Grail is kept. And that's what they're looking for. Why it's holy, or what makes it important, is usually left unsaid. Indeed, in most of these kinds of stories, it's almost a magical type of thing. This changes, however, in the early 13th century work of Robert de Boron. He wrote a poem called Joseph of Arimathea, and this is a completely different approach to what the Grail was. In this one, Robert de Boron really turns this idea of the Grail into a relic. And the star of the story is not knights, as it was in the previous romances, but the star is the Grail itself. It becomes almost a kind of a poetic hagiography for the Grail. And subsequent Grail stories would focus very much on the things that Robert de Boron writes about. In his story, he says that after Christ is arrested, a Jew took the vessel in which Christ broke the bread at the Last Supper. So again, it's a kind of a dish. And he gives it to Pilate. Now, Pilate doesn't want it, so he gives it to Joseph of Arimathea. After the crucifixion, Joseph then uses the vessel to catch Christ's blood as he's washing the body, preparing it for burial. Subsequently, 3 days later, when Christ's body disappears from the tomb, Joseph is arrested by the Roman authorities. And it's while he's in prison that Jesus appears to him and then gives him back the vessel and releases him from the prison. And Jesus says to him, quote, "Joseph, you took me from the cross, and you know well that I took the Last Supper at the house of Simon the leper, where I said that I was to be betrayed. And I said at that table, several tables will be established in my service to make the sacrament in my name." Joseph now, in the story, gathers various disciples with him, and they become a kind of a company of the Grail. They're determined to protect this vessel. On one occasion, though, they're sitting at a table with the vessel. And those who are good and not sinful feel great joy. And because of that, they say, quote, those who wish to name it rightly would call it the Grail, which gives such joy and delight to those who can stay in its presence that they feel as elated as a fish escaping from a man's hands into the wide water. Now, this is lost in translation, but this is really a play on words. The word agréer means delight, agréer. And this is connected to Grail, which is Grail. And that's why they give it the name that they do. Joseph passes the Grail then, later on to his brother-in-law, whose name is Bronn, which some people have noticed. Bronn is an awful lot like the name Bran from Bran the Blessed, the old Celtic stories of the King of Britain. This Bronn becomes a king. He becomes, in fact, the Fisher King of Percival. Merlin is then brought into the story. He learns about the Grail, and he tells Arthur that he needs to create a round table, and he needs to leave one seat on that round table open for the knight who has been in the presence of the Grail. The round table, he says, is connected to the Grail. In other words, it's connected to it because of Christ's words, in which Christ talks about various tables that will be established. And the round table is one of those. Merlin tells Arthur that he in fact cannot conquer Rome, which he's hoping to do, until this Grail quest is complete, until a knight who has been in the presence of the Grail can sit in that chair. The story then follows pretty much what Christian de Troyes' story, Percival, suggested. Percival then goes to the Fisher King. He sees the lance and the Grail, but he doesn't ask about it. Then he goes off and travels. He eventually meets the hermit who makes everything better. But then Robert adds more details to it. After another year of questing, in this story, Percival returns to the castle and he meets his grandfather, who is the elder Fisher King. And then he finally asks the question. He's given the ability finally to ask the question, please tell me, what are these things for? What is the purpose of the Grail? What is the purpose of the lance? And as soon as he asks the question, the Fisher King is instantly healed. So this, therefore, is the story of the Holy Grail. This is the Holy Grail legend. And that's really all that it ever was. Although there be other components of this story that would be developed over time, that would be developed in various romances, this is pretty much the final version of what the Holy Grail was. It was created in literature, and it developed and matured in literature. Now, does this mean there is no physical Holy Grail? Well, that depends on what you mean by Holy Grail. If we define the Holy Grail as not a very richly decorated cup or bowl or platter of some sort, then sure, there's lots of decorated cups and platters, none of them magical in the Middle Ages. But what if we define it, as Robert de Boron does, as a cup or a vessel that was used by Christ at the Last Supper, this later interpolation of what the Holy Grail was? What if that's what we mean by Holy Grail? Well, Europe, medieval Europe, was filled with relics of every sort, particularly relics that had anything to do with the Passion of Christ. Those were, in fact, among the most important relics. So, yes, there were many cups and vessels around Europe that purported to be those that were at the Last Supper. None of these, however, have any connection to Holy Grail, at least the Holy Grail as we've just referred to it in these romances. But let's have a look at them anyways. There are a couple that are of interest. In fact, the one that is probably the most interesting is the relic of the cup used at the Last Supper. That is today in the Cathedral of St. Mary of Valencia. It's a small agate cup. There's a variety of evidence that this was the chalice that was used in early centuries by the popes when they performed Mass in Rome, and which by tradition, when they would said Mass back in those early centuries, when they would do the words of consecration, they would refer to this most famous chalice, because it was this famous chalice that was supposed to have been used by Christ himself. The belief was that St. Peter had brought this chalice, or this cup, with him when he came from Jerusalem and then Antioch and then finally to Rome. And he brought it naturally because Christ had used it. It was then taken, it was said, from Rome during the 4th century, during various persecutions against the Christians. And it was moved from monastery to monastery in Spain and then eventually ended up in Valencia. Modern analysis seems to confirm that the cup dates, or at least is consistent with the cup dating to the 1st century, but there are other sorts of tests that could be done on it, and there still remain skeptics. It was used recently, in fact, very recently used by popes in the consecration during Mass. Pope John Paul II, in fact, used it in November 1982. And there were a lot of people hoping that he would use those special words of the consecration, this most famous chalice, during the Eucharistic consecration, but he did not. He just simply did the regular liturgy. However, in July of 2006, Pope Benedict XVI used the chalice at Mass, and he, in fact, did use those special words. Well, so is that the Holy Grail? It has nothing to do with the Holy Grail, not the Holy Grail of legend. If the relic of the Last Supper survives, which is an enormous if, then this has more claim to be it than probably any other relic. The other most famous of the supposed Holy Grail relics is the Genoa chalice. It's much more like a bowl, a wide-brimmed bowl. It was found probably, there's a couple of different stories, but it was probably found in a mosque after the capture of Caesarea by the Crusaders in 1101. It's very beautiful. It was thought to be an emerald bowl. It's translucent. Light shines through it. In fact, you can see it still in Genoa today, and its light is shown through it so that you can see how bright it is. It's very beautiful, and it was believed by the Crusaders when they captured Caesarea that this was the cup or the vessel that was used by Christ at the Last Supper. It was venerated by the Genoese for many centuries as the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, or the vessel used by him. The Genoese worked hard to get this. In fact, we are told they were instrumental in the capture of Caesarea by the Crusaders, and they could have asked for a great deal, including a whole portion of the city, but they said that they wanted nothing more than just this relic. And this fits with how much they venerated it once it had come back to Genoa. Unfortunately, the story of it being made of emerald ended up not surviving, primarily because after Napoleon conquered Italy in the 18th century, he took this, like he took so many things, back with him to Paris. After Napoleon was defeated, it was then returned to Genoa, but when it returned, it was found to be broken. And when it was examined, it turned out that it was not made of emerald, but it was made out of a green Egyptian glass. As an element in Arthurian legend, the Holy Grail remained about as important as the rest of the chivalric stories and myths were. Like the Arthurian legends, they waned in importance and interest in the 17th and 18th centuries, but they became much more interesting to people in the 19th century, largely because of the rise of Romanticism, in which people began to be much more interested in the kind of romantic chivalry of an imagined Middle Ages. Nevertheless, in the 19th century, while people were going on and on about the Holy Grail and the wonderfully chivalric knights, you can expect Mark Twain poked fun at it. He mentions the Holy Grail in his book, The Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. He writes, "The boys all took a flyer at the Holy Grail now and then. It was a several years' cruise. They always put in the long absence, snooping around the most conscientious way, though none of them had any idea where the Holy Grail was, and I don't think any of them actually expected to find it, or would have known what to do with it if he had run across it. Every year expeditions went out Holy Grailing, and the next year relief expeditions went to hunt for them. There was worlds of reputation in it, but no money. And the Holy Grail would continue to be a subject of jokes, such as probably most famously in the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail, in which the knights read the last words of Joseph of Arimathea, which directs them to the castle Arg, and Galahad is lured into a nunnery by a grail-shaped beacon. And when Arthur and his knights ask a French garrison whether they wish to join them on the quest for the Holy Grail, they respond that they have already got one and that it's very nice. And, of course, there are many other depictions of it in popular culture. Perhaps one of the most famous is the Last Templar who protects the Holy Grail in the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. What about legends of the Holy Grail more recently? It's rather odd to think that the Holy Grail, which was really just a literary device, has become fairly important in more recent times. This is because of a strain of historical writing, which really begins in the 1970s. It was a kind of a trend of pseudo-history that developed. If you think of like Eric von Donigen's Chariots of the Gods, in which he claimed that ancient astronauts had come and essentially created the pyramids and other sorts of things. These kinds of histories really changed the way people thought about history. Prior to the 1960s and 1970s, people thought of historical scholarship and historical research as a way to learn about the past, and as historians as people who were trying to illuminate the past. But probably as a result of the 60s revolution, the kind of reaction against the establishment and all of the culture that came out of that, there started to have a kind of a feeling that historians were the establishment and that there was a real history out there, a secret history that they were keeping people away from. And von Donigen's work particularly plays on this theme, that these historians don't want you to know that ancient astronauts once came and built all these things for us. Well, the Holy Grail was a natural for this, actually, and it would soon be kind of pulled into this. The method that authors like this use, and I should say none of these are trained historians, they're just simply writers, it's always pretty much the same. It's what I refer to as the bag of history method. What you do is you come up with a theory, the more outlandish the better, and then you go across history looking for evidence taken completely out of context, and you place it all into the little spots in your theory. Anywhere where the theory doesn't work, you simply just wave your hands and say, well, clearly there's so much evidence that just suggests this that it must be true. And you ignore all other evidence to the contrary. And as a result, you can prove almost anything. And then when historians say that it makes no sense or there's a vast amount of evidence to demonstrate that it's wrong, you simply say, see, that's part of the conspiracy. They're trying to silence us. Well, in the case of the Holy Grail, we see this in 1982 with the publication of the book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail by Michael Begent, Richard Ley, and Henry Lincoln. It claimed that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had married and that their descendants later became the Merovingian dynasty in France, the royal dynasty there. This secret was discovered, they said, after the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099, when they found various genealogies and other documents. This then led to the creation of a secret society known as the Priory of Zion, which was dedicated to preserving the sacred bloodline of Christ and restoring it to pan-European rulership. The Knights Templar, of course, came into this. They were the ones protecting all of that. Well, where does the Holy Grail come in? The Holy Grail, they said, was actually the bloodline of Christ. Now, how could that be? Well, what they did was they used a misreading of the Holy Grail by an English author, John Hardying, in the 15th century. John Hardying did not have a very good grasp of French, and he read Saint Grail, which would mean Holy Grail, wrongly. He moved the G over and read it as Sang Real, which would mean royal blood. By extension, these authors claimed, therefore, that the Holy Grail was actually a reference to the bloodline of Christ, and that it was also referred to the womb of Mary Magdalene, and that her bones were part of the Holy Grail too. The whole idea is absurd. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. In fact, the only evidence that exists is based on misreadings. It was largely forgotten by the late 1980s and 1990s, but, as you may know, it was resurrected in 2003 by Dan Brown's novelization of it in the book The Da Vinci Code. In that book, the Holy Grail is Mary Magdalene and the Grail relics and her bones and the documents that demonstrate the bloodline. And he, of course, uses the Sang Real misreading. Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute, he says. This was made up by the church to slander her. She was actually a member of the tribe of Benjamin. The Grail relics, then, which is not a cup, it's Mary Magdalene's body and these documents, were then hidden in Rosalind Chapel in Edinburgh, Scotland, by the Priory of Zion. The church suppressed the Grail and all of this story because they essentially hate women. And of course, Da Vinci, who was a member of the order, put clues into his Last Supper in which he omits John and instead puts Mary Magdalene next to Christ. And he points out that there's no chalice in the painting because she is the Grail. Of course, this is all absolutely ridiculous. And in fact, if you look closely at the Da Vinci painting of the Last Supper, you will see multiple cups on the table, two of which are within arm's reach of Christ. So the Holy Grail, which was originally just a device in French literature, has in our own time been transmorphized into becoming a grand conspiracy theory, one that dates back all the way to the time of Christ. In our next lecture, we're going to look at another fantastic claim, and that is the story of Pope Joan, the one and only female pope to reign in Rome.
This ends Lecture 2.